Spanking. What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? Spanking, and more broadly corporal punishment, are very controversial topics, to say the least. And I decided that I might as well look into the topic myself. And so I found this website, which obviously is very biased on this topic. It's called endcorporalpunishment.org. And they claim corporal punishment carries multiple risks of harm and has no benefits. Now I scrolled down a little bit and I went to the full review, which is here, and I saw this. Major meta-analyses of associations with corporal punishment 2002 and 2016. And the relevant detail here is Gershoff. I saw this name and I thought to myself, that sounds familiar. Now, she has published two meta-analyses, one in 2002 and one in 2016, which both come to the conclusion that corporal punishment, including spanking, is bad. Now, I was thinking to myself, Gershoff. Where do I know that name from? I know it from this. This is a meta-analysis written by not Gershoff. Now, I'm just going to do Control F and we'll look for Gershoff. Now, here's a very important detail about Gershoff. Of the 6 reviews of studies of corporal punishment published between 1996 and 2005, only Gershoff supports a spanking prohibition. So that's kind of fascinating, isn't it? There's 6 major studies that are meta-analyses of existing studies in corporal punishment, and only one of the 5 comes to the conclusion that there should be a prohibition on spanking. Now, that's not a statement about all corporal punishment. It's a specific statement about spanking. So let's think about that a little bit. Only 1 out of 6 say that we should have a spanking prohibition. The remainder don't. And there's an interesting detail here about Gershoff. In Gershoff's meta-analysis, she notes this. Because these meta-analyses are based primarily on correlational studies, parental corporal punishment cannot be identified definitively as the cause of these child behaviors. It is conceivable that the causal direction is reversed from what might be expected, such that children are driving the associations. Or there might also be a third variable that predicts both parents' use of corporal punishment and child behavior, such as parents' inconsistent style of discipline. Now, that's a good point, and that's Gershoff herself notes that basically correlation does not equal causation, and rather it might be that children who already have problems are the ones who are more likely to receive corporal punishment. It's not that the punishment causes the problems, but it's rather that the problems cause the corporal punishment. But as it says here, Gershoff has also said, taken together, the findings from these research studies support a causal link between parents' use of physical punishment and increases in children's future aggression, over and above the propensity for disobedient aggressive child behavior to elicit parental physical punishment. Now it says right there, causal link. What are we to make of this? I mean, what can we do with a person like this? She says that correlation doesn't equal causation, that that's absolutely true. And then she goes on to say that, no, actually these studies that cannot at all be proven to be causational, they cannot, as it says, the corporal punishment cannot be identified definitively as the cause of these child behaviors. Nevertheless, actually, no, they are causational. What to do? Well, what we can do is recognize this. Firstly, Elizabeth Gershoff is a fringe scholar, as it says up here. Only Gershoff supports a spanking prohibition. 6 reviews, and she's the only one, right? But let's take a look at Elizabeth Gershoff. Now, she works at the University of Texas at Austin. In her bio, what does she say? This is an issue. She says, I approach my research with a focus on the principle that all children deserve protection from violence, a right adults already enjoy. My research. This is a huge problem. You cannot approach your research with a conclusion already in mind. That is not research, that's what's called an opinion column. Why do I say this? Elizabeth is a scientist. She is an accredited psychologist. In fact, I believe we have her resume. Is it here? Yes. So Dr. Gershoff has a PhD in child development and family relationships. She has a bachelor's in psychology, and she has a master's in exactly the same degree as her doctorate. Now, I think she would qualify as a scientist. I mean, psychology is a science, right? Let's look at the scientific process, also known as the scientific method. The scientific process works in a series of 5 steps that must be followed in order. Number 1, define a question to investigate. Number 2, make predictions. This is called a hypothesis, right? Number 3, gather data. Number 4, analyze the data. 5, draw conclusions. And it says right here in the conclusion section, scientists can then decide whether the evidence clearly supports or does not support the hypothesis. If the results are not clear, they must rethink their procedure. The conclusions they draw usually lead to new questions to pursue. Now, that is very, very useful, right? The question is number 1, define a question to investigate. And the conclusion is number 5. How is it that Dr. Gershoff can, as she says, approach her, quote, research with a principle that all children deserve protection from violence, a right adults already enjoy? Adults, broadly speaking, in most countries, cannot be legally spanked unless perhaps it's the legal system that does so, and most countries don't do that. So in Elizabeth's country, the United States, it's certainly not legal for a random person to discipline another adult by spanking them. So that's absolutely true that in the context of spanking, adults do have the right not to be spanked, certainly not by just some other adult, right? That it's just not allowed. But what's the issue here? The reason why an adult cannot spank another adult is because you don't have the authority to do that. You're not in a position of responsibility over another adult, and it's not your responsibility to discipline them in any way. And that's why it's illegal. A parent does have responsibility over a child. They do have the responsibility and therefore the authority and the right to discipline their children within the bounds of what society considers reasonable. And that's why there's a discourse around corporal punishment and specifically spanking, which should not be confused with other forms of corporal punishment. The issue is, this is not an apples to apples comparison. It's apples to oranges. Yes, other adults cannot spank other adults, but that has nothing to do with disciplining children, because you do have the right to discipline your child. So whatever rights adults have is a separate question from what rights children have. Children are forcibly confined in public schools 5 days a week. Do you have the right to forcibly confine an adult in a public school? Absolutely not. Adults have the right to vote. Children don't. Adults from the age of 21 have the right to drink alcohol. Children don't. Children don't have all the same rights as adults. Advocating that children should have a right, like the right to drink alcohol, just because an adult does, doesn't make any sense. Children are a different class of person, and they need more protections. And they also need more discipline than adults do. And so this idea that children should have all the same protections from all of the same things as adults is not rational, and it's not something you say in good faith. But most importantly, as to whether I agree or disagree with Dr. Gershoff, the biggest issue is the scientific method. You cannot draw a conclusion before you've done the experiment. And yet she herself says, it's her words, she said, I approach my research with the principle that corporal punishment is wrong. Children deserve protection from violence. So she already has the conclusion, step 5, in place before she even does step 1, asking the question. In other words, Elizabeth Gershoff is certainly an accredited scientist, but Elizabeth Gershoff does not perform science experiments. She does not perform scientific studies. She writes opinion columns that simply look like they're scientific studies. Now, it's important to understand that Elizabeth Gershoff has no excuse for her behavior. There is no excuse for this behavior. This is not good faith. It's not acceptable to have a strong bias and seek to prove your bias to be correct when you perform studies. That's not science. That is not following the scientific process or the scientific method. And to give you an example of a researcher who recognizes that perhaps their earlier assumptions weren't true and proceeds with genuine research designed to find out whether their original biases were true or not, is Dr. Meck, who is a man who researches wolves. And to quote him here, he says, "The concept of the alpha wolf is well ingrained in the popular wolf literature, at least partly because of my book, The Wolf, Ecology and Behavior of an Endangered Species, written in 1968, published in 1970, republished in paperback in 1981, and currently still in print despite my numerous pleas to the publisher to stop publishing it. Although most of the book's info is still accurate, much is outdated. We have learned more about wolves in the past 40 years than all of previous history." As it says, there are not alpha wolves. In other words, they are merely breeders or parents, and that's what we call them today. The breeding male and the breeding female, or the male parent and the female parent, or the adult male and the adult female. And so what he's pointed out here is that it's been found that wolf packs tend to be families rather than an assortment of wolves from different families. And so the leaders of the family, plural, is not the alpha male, rather it's the parents, it's the literal biological parents of the other wolves in the pack. And so in a sense, there are leaders of a wolf pack. It's not democratic, but it is sort of a monarchy of a king and a queen, not some sort of alpha male who rules over the other males in some sort of prescribed order or something like that. Now, what is the point here? Are we talking about wolves? No, we're talking about corporal punishment and specifically spanking of children. But Dr. Meck is an example of someone who is humble and recognizes that sometimes, not only do we make mistakes, but it's not even entirely a mistake. We just sometimes have access to information that as we go on to do more research, we find maybe that's not so true. And he's willing to look back at his own books and his own research and say, well, actually, now we know more, and I don't really believe this anymore. That's humble, that's logical, and that's mature. That's what scientists should do. Now, Dr. Gershoff, under her research section, has listed a couple of grants that she's gotten. In one case from the city of Austin, but mostly it is from the federal government, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the Eunice Kennedy Shriver, that's part of the National Institute of Health, again, National Institute of Health, National Science Foundation, again, National Institute of Health. And she's getting a lot of money. I mean, look at that, $1.5 million for just one grant from the NIH. So I decided to look one of these up. This is on reporter.nih.gov. This is a grant, and the project leader, as it says here, is Elizabeth T. Gershoff. Now, the amounts of this grant is listed. Where are we? It is for a total funding of $586,000 from the National Institute of Health. Now, there are some sub-projects here, and Dr. Gershoff is one of the people who is receiving this money. She got $189,000 personally, presumptively for her research. Now, there's a bunch of, as it says, publications that are associated with this grant, okay? Quite a few. And so I decided to look up just a couple of them to see what's going on with Dr. Gershoff. Now, one of these is another meta-analysis published in 2021, just last year. And Dr. Gershoff is one of the people listed here. Now, something that I thought was interesting was in this thematic overview section, right in the middle of the study, and it says that physical punishment consistently predicts child behavior problems over time. That sounds like something that Dr. Gershoff has said. Now, they point out the overwhelming conclusion from the studies that we examined I just want to point out who is on this study. Elizabeth T. Gershoff. Who is the leader of these studies? So Elizabeth T. Gershoff. She's the one who received the grant from the federal government. So she's in charge, right? So let's look up the world overwhelming conclusion. From the studies that we examined is that physical punishment predicts an increase in behavioral problems over time. This finding is consistent with 3 meta-analyses that have found parents' use of physical punishment to be associated with increased child behavior problems, including aggression. Now there's 3 footnotes here. Now these are linking to 3 meta-analyses. The first one is the 2016 meta-analysis by Elizabeth T. Gershoff. The second one is a meta-analysis by Elizabeth T. Gershoff. And the third one, thank goodness, is finally from someone other than Elizabeth T. Gershoff. So at least we got one other person that appears to agree with her. But isn't that interesting that this is a yet another meta-analysis of studies, and so they're carefully choosing which studies do and don't go in their present meta-analysis, and of the meta-analyses they chose, 2 of them are by Elizabeth Gershoff, and all 3 of them necessarily must be chosen by Elizabeth Gershoff because she's the one in charge of this whole project. So I think that speaks for itself. This is a very incestuous approach to making meta-analyses where you're not really looking for the truth. You're just reviewing pre-existing studies and trying to prove your point over and over again. But now let's get to this, because at the end of the day, it is interesting to learn about Dr. Gershoff and how she manipulates information to come to pre-formulated conclusions. But this study is not a meta-analysis. This is an actual, you could say it's a primary source. So I'm just going to summarize this for you as quickly as I can. So this study is a twin study, and the idea is to compare the treatment of both identical, that's monozygotic, and fraternal, that's dizygotic, twins, when raised by different parents to see if there's a certain impact on the child of their parents' behavior. So do I cause my child to become more antisocial through my behavior? And ideally, specifically through monozygotic, so identical twins, if they show differences in antisocial behavior, this would show that the parents' behavior impacts the child, which seems like common sense, but it's actually valuable to study this. Now, let's take a look at one of the very specific claims that Dr. Gershoff has made about what this study will cover. Although such findings support the presence of an environmental association between harsh parenting and children's behavior problems, results are less certain than one would like for 2 reasons. First, empirical studies have yet to focus on monozygotic differences, so that's identical twins, and what is arguably the harshest form of parenting, hitting or spanking children. It is as yet unknown whether physical punishment per se, that means in and of itself, is environmentally associated with youth behavior problems, whether it reflects genetic confounds or whether it reflects some combination of the 2. This is a notable gap in our knowledge base given that the physical punishment of children by parents remains relatively common. Okay, so I'm going to deselect this real quick, and right here, this is the introduction to her study, okay? So scientific process, scientific method. This is where she's stating what she's going to cover. In fact, she says it's a problem that we have a gap in our knowledge about what she calls the harshest form of parenting, hitting or spanking. Now let's pause there for a second. Hitting or spanking children is an incredibly broad statement. That could mean spanking, so hitting the seat of the pants, the buttocks, usually with some sort of implement, but often with an open hand, which is what a lot of psychologists recommend. Not using an implement, they recommend using your hand. But it says hitting or spanking children. That could include smacking them in the head. Don't do that. Could mean hitting them in the eyes. It could mean hitting their hands. That's unfortunately more common than you might think. Don't do that. It's easy to damage hands. The bones are very small, especially in children. So hitting or spanking children is not very specific at all. That's not isolating the variable of spanking, is it? That's pretty broad. Now, moving on, we need to take a look at the design of the study. How are they collecting data on which parents are doing what to which children? Okay, so in order to examine harsh parenting, they did this. We examined 2 indicators of parenting. The parent-child conflict scale on the Parental Environment Questionnaire assesses harsh and conflictive parenting, and both, as it says, mothers and fathers individually rated their participating twins, whereas twins individually rated the parenting they received from mothers and fathers, respectively. So they're using this PEQ. Now, it took me a while to find this. I did eventually have to go look up this study itself from 97, but I did find it. And so these are examples of topics that the PEQ asks about. And so what's relevant here for our discussion is the conflict section, the first questions here. So I'm just going to read these off for you. Often lose temper with son, often have misunderstandings with son, son and I often argue, often criticize son, son often angers or annoys me, often hurt son's feelings, often irritates son, sometimes hit son in anger, son has been really scared of me, often interrupt son, son respects others more than me, often do not trust son's decisions. And there's a number assigned by the psychologist who designed this PEQ to represent how much conflict this represents. So on the low end of the scale, often do not trust son's decisions is 0.44. That's the smallest indicator of conflict in terms of how much significance they assign to it. The highest is often lose temper with son. Now, there's only one thing on this entire list, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 questions. Only one of those 12 questions actually discusses physical punishment. And it says sometimes hit son in anger, and that's represented by a 0.54 degree of conflict, which is much lower than the 0.76 associated with often lose temper with son, 0.7 associated with often have misunderstanding with son, 0.68 son and I often argue. Now, if you don't see where we're going with this, let me tell you. The issue here is that only one of these 12 questions actually evaluates any form of corporal punishment, sometimes hit son in anger, and that is by these psychologists that designed the PEQ. That is considered only a medium level of conflict. And since the harshness, I'm going to go back to the study, the harshness of a parent's parenting is determined by the answers on the PEQ. Well, that matters a lot because 11 out of the 12 questions on the PEQ have nothing to do with corporal punishment. And so a parent that is considered on this scale that they're using, the harshest parents, would not necessarily be people that use corporal punishment at all. 11 out of the 12 questions have nothing to do with corporal punishment. And the types of conflict that cause you that are considered the harshest form of conflict are not corporal punishment. The three harshest ones are often lose temper with son, often have misunderstandings with son, son and I often argue. Two of those three are explicitly verbal, misunderstandings and arguing, and often lose temper with son does not indicate that they're engaging in physical beatings. And so when you look at the actual way that a parent is rated as harsh, firstly, it's subjective. It's relying on both the children and the parents to give honest answers. But secondly, overwhelmingly, this has nothing to do with corporal punishment. And thirdly, and I think this is really the most important one, since I'm not here to defend all corporal punishment, it says sometimes hit son in anger. It doesn't say spanking. And anybody who knows a little bit of anecdotes about people who grew up with dads or mothers who hit them in anger, when a parent is hitting a child in anger, quite often that's not spanking. That is slapping them in the face. I know someone who's been thrown into a door by his father. I know someone whose dad came and slapped him on the thigh really hard, which I assume was pretty hard when he's angry. That doesn't necessarily indicate spanking, which is the relevant question. Nobody's asking about all kinds of physical punishment in any situation. So as we can see, the design of this study, even when we dig into the details, it doesn't deal with spanking at all, and it barely deals with hitting. You could be considered, by the metrics of the study, an extremely harsh parent, even if you don't engage in any physical punishment at all. And so this study is simply not addressing the relevant question of either hitting, and it completely does not address at all the issue of spanking. We need to look at Dr. Gershoff and what she says about policy. So down in the discussion section, Dr. Gershoff says this: The possibility that genetic confounds underlie the association between harsh parenting and children's antisocial behavior has cast some doubt on whether harsh parenting broadly and hitting children specifically truly causes deterioration in children's behavior. Carefully evaluating this possibility is critical given the significant policy implications of this work, e.g., banning physical punishment. Now, what did we just learn? We just learned that this study barely at all looks into hitting children. And this isn't looking into hitting children as a form of constructive punishment. This is just barely at all looking at the issue of hitting children at all. Even talk to very conservative Americans, and they'll tell you that hitting your child in anger is bad. Nobody's defending that. They're defending A, spanking, B, as a constructive, prescribed punishment, which your child's already been warned about, and they already know the rules, and when they break the rules, they get spanked. It's nothing about generally hitting children. It's definitely not about hitting children in anger. But that's the only thing that this study briefly hits on. 1 out of 12 questions. And again, this study determines whether a parent is harsh not based off of, there's only one question about hitting children. And again, that one is not weighted very heavily. That's 0.54, sometimes hit son in anger. Often lose temper, have misunderstandings, often argue, often criticize. Those are all verbal issues, and those are weighted more heavily. You can be a very harsh parent and never lay a finger on your child, according to this study. And so this study, she says right here, whether harsh parenting broadly and hitting children specifically. Well, this study doesn't specifically study hitting children. That variable is not isolated. It's one of 12 questions, and it's right in the middle. You can't determine by this study whether a harsh parent engages in corporal punishment. The variable is not isolated, so they didn't study hitting children specifically. And she says, carefully evaluating this possibility. She didn't carefully evaluate this possibility. She barely evaluated it at all. And there's no way to look at the results of the study and say, aha, the harsh parents in the study therefore hit their children, and therefore, since it appears that harsh parenting is bad for kids, which it is, therefore hitting children is bad for kids. No, the study doesn't conclude that. It doesn't study that at all. But there's even one more detail that's useful in the discussion section. Now, if we go down to the discussion section, we can go down and look here at this very important statement. Despite these strengths, several limitations are noted. First, our measure of physical punishment did not directly assess spanking, the most common form of physical punishment by parents. However, spanking is a form of hitting, and thus the use of the term hit was appropriate. Although the use of the qualifier in anger could be tapping, I don't know what that means, something closer to physical abuse, most parents admit that the main reason they physically punish their children is because they are angry at them. Let's pause there. This is probably the most relevant part of the study. So, as it says, our measure of physical punishment did not directly assess spanking. Well, that's a huge problem, because most people would agree that there are many physical punishments for children that are inappropriate. There are parents who abuse their children by lighting a cigarette and then stubbing out that lit cigarette on their children's arm. That's abuse, and that's not spanking. There are parents who take things way too far. They'll tie their kids up by their feet and hang them from the ceiling. Is that spanking? No, that has no relation to spanking. That's just abuse. There's an unthinkable number of ways that you can corporally punish your children that are very painful, traumatic, disturbing, and clearly abusive. But nobody is discussing any of these crazy abusive practices that are practiced by abusive parents. It's just a question of spanking. And when we say spanking, we mean on the seat of the pants. We don't mean hands. We don't mean their head or their eyes or their genitals or anything like that. It doesn't mean kicking your kids in the stomach. It's very specific what spanking means. And as this person just said, this study does not directly assess spanking. In fact, if you read the study, and I encourage you to do so, it doesn't directly assess any physical punishment at all. It simply categorizes parents based on a subjective assessment of whether they are more or less harsh, and then examines outcomes for children based on whether their parents were more or less harsh. It never even specifies corporal punishment. It's not about the exact facts of what the parent does. It's just a question of, do you and your child subjectively assess you as a harsh parent? The harshest parents are not necessarily ones that use physical punishment. The harshest parents are ones who use verbal emotional abuse, calling your child stupid, lazy, ugly, telling them they'll never be successful, and telling them at worst, I don't love you and I don't care about you. That is so much more hurtful than any physical punishment. And those would certainly be the harshest parents. And yet a study like this, with a terrible methodology that isn't specific at all, would clearly lump those kinds of parents in, who might not use physical punishment at all, with people who spank their kids. This study does not address the question. And I want to point out that this is the question. It says so. It's in the introduction. We'll go up here. They're actually asking the question. This is, keep in mind the scientific process. Number one, define a question to investigate. Where are we? We're in the introduction of the study. And it says it's going to address hitting or spanking children. It is as yet unknown whether physical punishment per se, blah, blah, blah. This study claims that it's going to address the question. Does it? Does it specifically address spanking? No. First, our measure of physical punishment did not directly assess spanking. I will also point out that just in this paragraph, Elizabeth Gershoff claims that the literature already supports certain viewpoints, like spanking is a form of hitting, and therefore all studies about hitting are obviously about spanking, which is not true. People who, beat their kids in the face with a baseball bat are not spanking their kid. That's hitting, but it's not spanking. So no, you can't infer that a study about hitting is accurate to the effects of spanking. She also says that if parents physically punish their children, it must be because they're angry. Well, that's not true at all. It's ridiculous to say that. Some parents do, but also some parents punish their kids in a non-physical way when they're angry. Oftentimes, parents are angry when they punish their children, whether physically or not. And she's simply saying that because many people physically punish their children because they're angry, which is probably true sometimes, therefore all people who physically punish their children must be doing it because they're angry. That's not accurate. This is a very basic logical fallacy. And yet here we have a full-grown woman, a psychologist with a PhD, engaging in a logical fallacy that, as you can see, is not supported by her study. And she's making her claims try to appear like they're supported by citing her own studies, Gershoff, 2013, and Gershoff, 1999. Elizabeth Gershoff, bachelor's, master's, and doctorate. She is a very qualified person. And here she is engaging in logical fallacies and pretty much just outright lies to try to prove her point. That is the kind of person Elizabeth Gershoff is. And she's been doing this for over 2 decades. And she has received, this is just one grant, right? We can go back to her page here on the utexas.edu. She's gotten $300,000, $1.1 million, $1.5 million, $870,000, $110,000, $999,000, $1.3 million. And she's received far more. This woman has probably received over at least $7 million worth of grants in her career. And this is the kind of garbage that she's putting out. I wouldn't say it was garbage if it was high quality, but again, her introduction said she's going to address the question of spanking or hitting. And then her study didn't do that. That's the hypothesis, which includes spanking, and then her study doesn't do that. She then conflates spanking, like hitting your child's butt with a paddle. She conflates that with any form of hitting without controlling for severity of any kind, frequency, severity, injuries. No, she doesn't bother to control for that. And her study does not isolate the independent variable of spanking. This is junk science from someone who is not a junk scientist. Elizabeth Gershoff is someone who knows better. She knows better. And yet, what do we have? What do we have? Elizabeth Gershoff is being cited by endcorporalpunishment.org. And this kind of garbage research is ultimately influencing even an organization like the World Health Organization, which obviously the World Health Organization is known for being very corrupt, but regardless, they're still influential. And her research ultimately influences organizations like this. In fact, on endcorporalpunishment.org's research, it says that on October 5th of last year, 2021, they hosted an event by their website and the World Health Organization. Interesting. So we have the World Health Organization making claims that are very similar to what Elizabeth Gershoff says. Why? Well, they get their information from endcorporalpunishment.org, who gets their information from Elizabeth Gershoff and her nonsense. And if we scroll down the page, who is it? Oh my gosh, it's Elizabeth Gershoff speaking at an event for the World Health Organization. It is hard to think of or identify anybody who has been more influential on the topic of corporal punishment and, unfortunately, spanking specifically, than Elizabeth Gershoff. But as we can see, even with decades of research under her belt, Elizabeth Gershoff is a liar. She does not perform scientific studies. She doesn't follow the scientific process, the scientific method, and she's not particularly interested in truth. Elizabeth is interested in pushing her own opinion. And when I say interested, I mean she's been doing this for over 20 years. She's at the point where she's influencing the World Health Organization, which, corrupt as it might be, still is one of the largest health organizations of any sort in the world. I think that about wraps up the issue. It's not only about Elizabeth Gershoff, it's also about the fact that, as Elizabeth herself pointed out, there is simply not much evidence at all, and nor is she helping to add evidence on this topic. The question of, is spanking causatively linked to harmful outcomes for children in the long term? The answer clearly is no, it's not linked. And Elizabeth, over more than 20 years, has done nothing to actually publish studies that directly address the issue. But at the end of the day, I think because there just cannot be proven any sort of link between negative outcomes and spanking, we just need to put this issue to rest. The issue has been studied many times, as in this meta-analysis here. Are spanking injunctions scientifically supported? 5 out of 6 studies said that they just don't see sufficient evidence to support a spanking prohibition. Do those other 5 reviews say that spanking is good? No. They simply say that there's just not enough evidence to support a spanking prohibition. It's been a long time that this issue's been studied, and over again, the proponents of no corporal punishment, it's all bad, for it's a generation at least of research, just can't find the evidence to support their conclusion. And I think it's really time for egotistical people like Elizabeth Gershoff to just give it up. It's just, if what you're saying is true, you just don't have the resources to prove it, and it's getting pointless. It's a waste of everybody's time. And as this study here shows pretty clearly, there are serious problems with banning corporal punishment. If we look at the Sweden study that's mentioned in this very literature review, what does it say? If spanking is prohibited, do parents then use more effective and less aversive disciplinary tactics instead? So if you ban spanking, do parents improve their disciplinary practices? 30 years after Sweden passed the first spanking ban, there's little supporting evidence. One comparison found that Swedish parents were less likely than American parents to use reasoning and behavior modification techniques, and more likely to use physical restraint, which is, by the way, another form of corporal punishment, and coercive verbal control. Support for disciplinary consequences has continued to erode in Sweden until only 31% of 10 to 12-year-olds thought parents had the right to ground them, and 53% thought parents had the right to remove their allowance. Similarly, therapists reported that Norwegian parents showed a surprisingly high prevalence of the permissive parenting form of child coercion. In these families, the parents often seem to be immobilized by unreasonable requests made by the child. A recent study in Quebec found that the annual percentage of mothers using minor physical discipline, usually spanking or slapping on the hand or arm, decreased from 48 to 43% from 1994 to 2004, but repeated psychological aggression increased from 48% to 52%. Psychological aggression consisted mostly of yelling or screaming, but also included cursing at children or calling them stupid. In some, the available evidence suggests that spanking prohibitions may increase the use of verbal hostility, which has been shown to be one of the most detrimental forms of parental discipline, with more detrimental effects than even physical child abuse in several studies. Spanking prohibitions may also increase the number of parents who cannot control their child's coercive behavior, which puts those children at risk for delinquency and crime. Very well put. There is a danger to this attitude that we should outlaw spanking. And as we can see, 5 out of 6 meta-analyses do not support the conclusion that we should ban corporal punishment. And this is the correct conclusion. The literature just does not support the conclusion. And as we have seen from this garbage published by Gershoff, she refuses to actually address the issue with her own study. She has over $200,000 to run this study, and, well, we didn't directly assess spanking. That's what she said she would do in the introduction, and then she doesn't do it. I think that Elizabeth Gershoff doesn't want the real answer to this question, because she already knows what the answer is, and she doesn't like it. She just doesn't like spanking. She has an emotional aversion to it, and she cannot be expected to be logical about the issue. I think that is really the beginning and the end of this issue. We just need to lay it to rest, give parents good advice on how to discipline their children, which does mean that we need to tell people if they're being too extreme, but we need to let parents parent, because parents know best. Politicians do not know best. Elizabeth Gershoff, who refuses to actually do real studies, clearly doesn't know best. So let's just leave it up to parents. Who knows a child better than his own mother and father? Who knows a little girl better than her own mother and her own father? Nobody. Nobody knows better than the parent, and so the decision should be left up to the parent. If you liked this video, if you thought it was interesting, please go ahead and leave a like, comment, whatever. I appreciate it. Have a good one.